So for my presentation, I studied Zionism, and I created an educating piece on the progression and continued protection of the Jewish state. So my essential question was, how has the progression of modern political Zionism affected past and present conflicts in Israel, and why is that important? I spent the month of December in Israel in 2020. I lived there with a bunch of Israelis. I was living in a hotel. We were in a bubble. We were training for the Israeli national lacrosse team. And one of my neighbors was a girl named Lee, and the man that lived above me, his name was Dor Rodrigo Benor, and I interviewed both of them. And during my time there, on Christmas, rockets were shot from the Gaza Strip into Ashkelon, which is the city we were living in. And it was just normal life for an Israeli, and I was unaware and unprepared. So they said, oh, just head down to the bomb shelter. And I was like, bomb shelter? What do you mean bomb shelter? And I think it's interesting that in Israel, they know about our politics and our government so much, but I feel like, at least as an American Jew, I don't know much about the Israeli politics and Israeli life. So we went down to the bomb shelter, and later videos were released of rockets shot out of the sky from the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Defense Forces shot them out of the sky, and they're 96% successful. And part of that 4% was a rocket that was launched and hit the apartment that was right next to the one that a lot of my friends were living in. So that apartment is now in ashes. So to put that into perspective a little bit, a lot of my purpose derived from wanting to know where those conflicts come from and wanting to understand Israeli government a little bit better. So my agenda today includes 4 questions aside from my essential question, which includes my purpose. Do all Jewish people believe in Zionism? Who created Zionism and what is it? And who was the first leader in Israel after its creation? My answers are found in my purpose, interviewing Israeli citizens, and comparing Theodore Herzl and David Ben Gurion's interpretation of Zionism. So to get started, you have to understand a basic understanding of Israeli Knesset today, and Knesset is their, that's what they call their legislature. So they have a parliamentary democracy, which is where citizens cast votes for political parties, and it's dominated by the center-left Labor Party. Although 79% of Israelis are Democratic and 21% are Republican, they use, they're more center-left and center-right, so they're towards the middle. And, there's Labor Zionists, revisionist Zionists, and religious Zionists. So my friend Lee is a religious Zionist, and my friend Dor Benor is more of a labor Zionist, although he doesn't define himself as a Zionist. And labor Zionists are typically center-left, while revisionist Zionists are more center-right. And keep that in mind while I continue. So on the left is Dor, and on the right is Lee. She's the first one in on the left. And I interviewed both of them and asked them 2 of the same questions. I asked them what Zionism means to them, and what do they think most of Israeli conflicts come from. So Dor said that he is not religious, but he identifies as Israeli, which means that he is more of a labor Zionist, and labor Zionists believe that there should not be a large international interference, I guess, with Israel, and that it should be created, and the establishment of Israel was mostly created by the working class settling in Israel, which is 60% of what Israelis believe, and 40% believe that there needs to be more of an international presence. While Lee is a Zionist, she's a practicing Jew, she sees the Bible as interpretive, while Dor believes that the Bible is more of a history textbook. And Lee believes that to be Jewish is to be empowered, and she also believes that we are always fighting for peace. And I categorize the Jewish opposition to Zionism into 4 main groups: practicing Jews that live in America that have never been to Israel, practicing Jews that live in America that have made Aliyah, which is when you return to Israel, and then practicing Jews that are Israeli citizens and live in Israel, and then practicing Jews or non-practicing Jews who live in Israel and are Israeli citizens. So Theodore Herzl, if you would like to have a base understanding of Israel's culture and how it was created and the establishment of the state, there are 2 main people that you need to know, which is David Ben Gurion and Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl created Zionism. He was a political activist, and he was from Vienna, Austria. And he came up with the idea of modern political Zionism during the Dreyfus case. And Jewish political Zionism is defined as granting Jews sovereignty in Jewish-owned territory. And he started the Basel program, which was where they created the Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, and it created a symbolic parliament which turned into what they use today in Israel. And he was considered a revisionist Zionist. Even though he did create it, he wanted to keep kind of evolutionizing the idea of Zionism, while David Ben Gurion was a labor Zionist, and he was part of the Labor Zionist Party. He was the first prime minister in Israel after its establishment, and he discusses in his book the perspective of an Arab in Israel and how they do want peace, but it is hard because they have settled in the land that was once the promised land for the Jewish people. And Dor Ben-Or talks a lot about the Canaan, which is where there were 12 tribes. 10 arrived in Israel and 2 did not, and they were the original settlers in the land. David Ben Gurion believes that returning the working class to Israel will create the establishment of the Jewish state rather than having an international presence. And he helped create the Jewish labor movement, which gained international recognition. And then if you know anything about Israeli politics or the Israeli government, this was one of the first things that got the U.S. involved in Israel. And some of my closing remarks include that more than 3 million Jews have made Aliyah in Israel since its establishment as a Jewish state, and 44% of the world's Jewish population reside in Israel. And part of my purpose today is just to give a basic understanding and to educate, Americans on Israeli politics and the government in Israel, as they do have a basis understanding of what's going on in America. And I think it's really important that if anything ever happens in the U.S., for example, it happened on January 6th, everyone in the U.S. knows about it immediately, and everyone around the world knows about it as well. While if something happens in Israel, it takes a long time for something that happens there to reach the media here, unless you read or hear about it on like BBC News. But it's never in American news, and I feel like there's a lack of communication between American politics and what is happening in Israel, despite them being allies. So if you learn anything today, or if you'd like to learn more, read my paper.
All right, questions for Grace?
Benny?
Would you say your experience and like your perspective before you went to Israel and then after you went to Israel, would you say your political perspective changed? And would you say for most people that's probably true as an American Jew, or would you say it sort of remained the same?
I'd say it changed a lot. I had no idea what was happening in Israel when I got there, and what I noticed first was that media in the U.S. is filtered towards what's happening in our country, and it kind of keeps us in this bubble. While in Israel, all they have is international news all the time. Like, I traveled to Poland after my time in Israel, and the news in Poland is vast, and it's talking about all of Europe and all of the Middle East. And I think I became a lot more politically aware of what's going on a macro scale rather than a micro scale. So I would say that it definitely did change my perspective, and that's kind of why I have the 4 different categories of Jewish Americans who have not yet made Aliyah. I think it's kind of a cultural awakening. So I would say yes.
All right.
Oh, yes, Ms. Collins.
Is there any version of Zionism that you believe is actually perpetuating the conflict today? And is there a version of Zionism that you think could alleviate the conflict that's happening between Israel and its neighbors today?
Revisionist Zionism, religious Zionism, and labor Zionism are all quite different. The labor Zionism is more militant based, so it's like the working class will settle in Israel, and that is their land, and they're a bit more strict, and they don't believe in peace as much as the revisionist Zionists do. So the revisionist Zionist Party is the one that kind of established the Egypt Peace Treaty in 1979. So the revisionist party is a bit more geared towards international involvement and creating peace with its enemies more than the Labor Party. Sarah?
I remember last year Mr. Johnson sent out email about the Israel-Palestine conflict and tried to explain it a little bit because there was a lot of confusion for students here. And I know at that time I was reading the New York Times to try and gain some understanding of what's happening, and there was information about it, but do you think that the information that's published in the U.S. doesn't reflect the whole extent of the event, or do you think that the US doesn't publish enough about it, or there aren't enough other publications?
I think it honestly kind of started back with the Holocaust, where there was so much lack of communication between what was happening in Europe and what was happening in the US, and I never really think that got mended. So I think there is a lack of communication because there's no one really reporting from Israel, and that could just be part of the Israeli government not wanting everything that they're doing to be publicized. But I also think that there is a lack of communication and that no one really gets the full story unless you're there in Israel. They don't really publicize that there are bomb shelters in the bottom of every house and building in Israel, and that you aren't allowed to travel more than 65 kilometers away from another bomb shelter. So last spring, all of my friends that were living in Israel and that are Israeli citizens weren't allowed to leave 65 kilometers from their house because they'd be too far away from a bomb shelter in case sirens were blaring again. So no one really talks about that, at least in the New York Times or anything that I've read. I have to go to BBC News to know what's going on, or I have to ask my friends directly. And I think that a lot of the information that I collected, I would never find in a news article. So I think there still is a lack of communication.